Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. We're certainly living in a time of transformation. Just about every issue we're dealing with is transforming very quickly. Today, that's going to be our topic, and my guest today is an expert on community transformations. Mr. Rick Smyre is an internationally recognized futurist specializing in the area of building capacities for transformation in local communities. He is a graduate of Davidson College and North Carolina State University. He's also president of the Center for Communities of the Future, a network of people and organizations in 47 states and 11 other countries. He's an architect of the new field of, quote, community transformation, unquote. Rick Smyre, welcome back to Global Connections Television.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be back with you.
The last time you were on Global Connections Television, you had just really published a book called Preparing for a World That Doesn't Exist Yet, Framing a Second Enlightenment for the Communities of the Future. That was really a groundbreaking book. It was a trend-setting book. What were some of the major concepts that you focused on in that really interesting piece of work that you did?
Well, thank you, Bill. We didn't think it would be coming this fast. I guess our friend, the president, Mr. Trump, is helping us along with this. But anyway, to answer your question, back in 1970, there was a shift in the way in which the future was considered. And so we began to think about the future in a totally different way. We began to think about the fact of if people collaborate together as opposed to trying to do it themselves, which led to a different form of leadership that we call process leadership, where we connect and collaborate together. And then the idea of how do you co-create totally new ideas in an age that is constantly changing, that will be increasingly interdependent, interconnected, and complex. So that book was an attempt to try to introduce totally new ideas. And I remember one person who read it and said, I'm having a hard time figuring out what you're trying to say, but I have this feeling that you're on target. And I laughed and I said, well, there are 4 stages of transformation. There's resistance, which I did for years, especially at my age of 78. The idea of thinking about the future with regard to thinking about shifts and change, the idea of the aha moment, as we call it. You go through from resistance to aha. And then if you begin to see the world differently, and this happened to me over a period of about a decade, you then just begin to integrate those ideas and you begin to think differently. So I think our book that you were nice enough to help us promote across the country and world 4 years ago, that got a really good review, and people were very complimentary about it. And one of the keys to it was it wasn't just me and it wasn't just my co-author that always does such a good job. It was a connection of individuals that we just happened to be the spokespersons for. So in my long-winded way, those 3 key ideas of building capacities and a shift from looking at the past for your answers to looking to the future for what may be emerging. And then how do you co-create together? Those 3 principles we find to be key.
And they certainly are. You have been approached now by the publisher of Changemaker Books. And what you're going to do, as I understand, is put together a series of books that will focus on these ideas that have really bubbled to the surface over the last 30 years. Is that correct?
Well, they certainly have bubbled, Bill, and I guess they're bursting now. And we didn't know whether some of these ideas were on target or not. But yes, we're delighted that Tim Ward, who is the publisher of Changemaker Books, that's based in Washington, D.C. and over in London, who published our book 4 years ago and has published some of the other colleagues, a part of our Communities of the Future network, has approached us about developing a series of books that would reflect different parts of our overall concept of transformation in society. And this relates to anything from transformational learning a new approach to the whole concept of education, to leadership, again, master capacity builder, which is a form of transformational leadership. The idea with regard to economic development, I was on the staff of the National Economic Development certification process for all economic developers back in the late 80s, late 90s and up to 2007. So they're interested in the fact of all the people that we have developed and connected with over the years. We're going to be treating this like a biological system. And so there will be 7 to 10 different key ideas that relate all to transformation in society. And then there'll be 3 authors that will develop 25 to 30 pages of a particular transformative concept that then we will connect them together and have then 3 people in 3 parts of the country and Canada that will have collaborated around the kind of ideas that I just mentioned. So we're really pleased with this, and I'm delighted that Tim had such a good experience with us the last time. He wants to develop a series so we can, in effect, focus on a lot of other people in their thinking. But the common denominator, again, is the concept of transformation, Bill. It's one thing to reform old ideas. It's another thing to have the challenge of trying to think through what is emerging that hadn't been in the past.
And these topics are very interesting and they're very important. And over the next several months, we'll have some of those authors who are participating on Global Connections Television. Rick, just to get me set straight anyway, how do you briefly define or distinguish between transformational change and reforming change? You're talking about it to some degree, but how do you look at those 2 terms and say, we're moving to transformational? Is that correct?
Bill, if you got 10 years, it only took me 10 years to learn the difference. That's a tongue-in-cheek comment.
We have a limited time frame.
Yeah, I hear you. But the basic answer to that is transformation is when you challenge the underlying assumptions of what's been in existence for hundreds of years, certainly in the Western culture, whether it be challenging the assumptions of how you educate, how you do economic development, how you lead. That reforming change, which has been around for a couple of 100 years or more, faster and faster, is trying to make old concepts and old ideas more efficient. So if you have a teacher in school, as an example, they're looking for ways to get students to be able to remember content of information. So they'll reform what they're doing by the way they change their curriculum. But if you're going to transform the way education is done, then as an example of that, you would, which we're beginning to do, you'd connect people in different parts of the country and the world and have them collaborate with students all over the place so that they're self-organizing the ability to transform the curricula and how they prepare for the kind of society and economy that's going to require them to think like that and make connections among totally disparate ideas.
Now, would this be part of the concept of building the capacity, the transformational capacity? Is this all tied into this? Is that exactly what you're describing?
That's a good question, Bill, because I was what I called for years. And of course, at my age, when I came along, you look for the one answer. You look for the item or what is it that we are to do. And what I've begun to understand is things have gotten faster and faster, and they've had so many different type of diverse connections that it's a system that's constantly changing. We're living in a cultural system in the world that no longer has one best answer. There may be one best answer for the moment, and whatever you're defining your particular situation in your community or in your network of leaders or in the way in which you educate. But we're seeing a time period where the transformation that is emerging is a constant type of change. And it undercuts the way in which things used to be done. And so therefore, the whole idea of building the capacities becomes important in getting not just leaders who facilitate this kind of thinking, but have other people understand that they're going to have to try to look ahead and anticipate what may be emerging because they can't predict the specifics of it anymore.
That's for sure. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, you like our shows, you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at this interesting concept of transformational change, how it affects us, how we're going to be looking at it even more differently in the future. My guest is an expert on this topic. Mr. Rick Smyre is an internationally recognized futurist specializing in the area of training capacities for transformation in local communities. Rick, this is an important concept. I'm just curious, so how do we're dealing with all kinds of tangible problems, climate change, human trafficking, just on across the board, insurrection as of a week, not too long ago. How do we translate this into the public sector, into the private sector? How do we really help people to better understand that the old ways of looking at problems and developing solutions that we used for hundreds of years, maybe we need to start looking at new ways to do it, because this society is evolving so quickly and so technologically advanced that we just are not sure which way it's going.
Well, Bill, you only gave me about 5 or 6 different access points, as I call them, to respond to that. But let me just start off in this way. You mentioned about 10 minutes ago, and related to the fact that you were alluding to the fact that things are changing so fast, and people today are open to new ways of thinking, and that 4 years ago, when you were nice enough to interview some of us, people were very courteous in the way they listened to some of our ideas. But now, Bill, it's not just a courteousness, it's a way in which they're listening. You can see it in their eyes, as well as the questions that they're asking. And so we didn't coin the term, but we were one of the early users of the term co-creation. And what we mean by that is that so many of us now have bits and pieces of understanding of what's going on, but no one person has enough knowledge that we need to connect and collaborate together. And so the ability to be able to emerge new ways of looking at the future is going to be directly connected to how we listen in a different way, how we think differently, and how we begin to, as I just alluded to a minute ago, build capacities so that new ideas can emerge that we can test out, and the ones that don't work, you throw away. Now, one other piece of the question, or the answer to your question, is that we did coin the idea of working about 20 years ago, working with what we call parallel processes. And so by that, I mean that you cannot use the old either or. I'm going to work in the short run or work in the long run, or I'm going to do one thing for the purposes of dealing with this issue of economic development, and at the same time not realize that you got to change the educational system to be able to do that from a new economic development standpoint. So we developed the idea of parallel processes, where in effect, as an example, you deal in the short run with the tangible outcomes of dealing with coronavirus, of dealing with climate change, of dealing with the racial issues inherent, because they're here and you have to work with them. But at the same time, the context of the world and the context of how you deal with those issues are in the process of transforming. They're not just changing, they're transforming. And so the more people you get connected with each other, where you're listening to each other, you're spinning off ideas and projects and programs, you're testing out what works and what doesn't work, then in turn, you're in a good position to begin to have the aha moment I mentioned in terms of the 4 stages of transformation. And we find that we learn something every day, Bill. There are no experts in this. You were nice enough to point to me as an expert. I'm not an expert. I just have become better at asking appropriate questions and working with people at a deep level.
That's what it takes. That's
It
exactly
sure
what it
does,
takes.
my friend.
Wait, when you were talking, I was thinking back, one of your colleagues, really a remarkable gentleman, Dr. John Cobb, I think from Claremont Institute in California, was on Global Connections Television a couple of years ago. And the guy is brilliant. In fact, our viewers can go to the website at globalconnectionstelevision.com to see that interview. But he coined a term, it's called ecological civilization. And of course, we've gone through the industrial age, and we're moving in his eyes and in the way he perceives it into this ecological civilization. How does that fit into what we're talking about today?
In a couple of ways, Bill. John, for those of your viewers who've never heard of John, and by the way, if you Google it, John, Dr. John Cobb, C-O-B-B, what emerges is he's one of the two most preeminent philosophers and theologians of the 20th century. And he's just a wonderful human being. I've known him for about 7 or 8 years. He was nice enough to ask me to write an article for a book that he brought a lot of us together globally to think about the future in new ways as it related to climate change. Well, John at 93 probably is one of the most creative thinkers, I think, to which you were alluding, that I know. And so that his capacity to be able to be open to new ways of thinking it's not unique, but there's nothing that I've ever brought up to him, Bill, that he doesn't see a connection. And that helped me. That was a part of my learning experience, because I watched John always take new information and new content, and as opposed to trying to be able to compare it against what he thinks in a very simple way, and not that he doesn't have strong opinions, but he's always looking to see something new that can connect. And so I've learned a lot from John, and John, interestingly enough, is the first person I called to ask to be a part of one of 3 authors of a book that relates to the term that you just used in terms of the concept that John has about ecological civilization, because in our own work, we've shifted to focusing on principles of physics like linear thinking, outcomes-based, one-factor thinking, to biology that says, let's interconnect and connect different nodes. Let's get different people connected and see what emerges from their dialogue using these concepts of biology. And John was one of those people through Ecological Civilization, when I read his book to start with, that I had some aha moments of my own, Bill. Of course, I have an aha moment every 15 minutes when I finally matured enough to be able to listen and question, as opposed to think I had to have the answer for everything.
Exactly. Well, we try to bring in a tangible topic. It usually is climate change, because in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of the folks out there, the scientists, climate change is our #1 issue we're dealing with, and it's getting worse. The global warming is taking place. 2020 was, and 2016, I believe, was the other 2 hottest years in our history. We see that the devastation is taking place, but now we have a new, more nebulous type of issue when we think back to January 6, 2021. And again, many people have labeled it as a day that will live in infamy. And this was when there was a frontal assault on the United States Capitol by a group of, you call them insurgents, traitors, whatever, that were motivated by primarily President Trump to overthrow a fair and free election and to keep him in power. How does what we're talking about today tie into this issue? And there are many facets that go into this. I realize it's not just a political issue, but there are other issues and sub-issues, if you will, like economics, cultural activities, whatever. How does this tie into what we're talking about today?
Well, Bill, since you said that this show lasts about 3.5 hours, I'll be glad to take a deep breath.
We'll extend it.
Of course, I'm kidding when I say that, but let me respond to your question in the best way I can, Bill. That I think this is an example. What we're going through right now is an example of this transformation that people historically in our educational system are taught to look for the outcome. And since things are shifting and changing so fast, we have so many people in this country that are in effect using a way of thinking that's no longer appropriate. And so therefore they become scared, especially if you don't have a job. And so that we have the concept of being able to build connections among the various people, processes, and ideas. And as you alluded to just then, everything's connected now. Everything's moving so fast and it's so interdependent and complex. So you no longer have things that are separate. You have to look to see how things are connected. And so I'll give you 3 ways in which I think in the long run, this phenomenon of Donald Trump and the reaction, the way in which we had the attack on the Congress this last week. One is it isn't going to happen. It's not just going to, in my opinion, it's not going to be quickly resolved. We're going to go through some tough times in the next several years, in my opinion. Number 2 is we don't have enough leaders across the country that have the capacity to what we call be transformative or master capacity builders that can build connections among totally disparate ideas, processes, and people. And so when you're dealing with this kind of complexity and when people think in very simple terms and you don't introduce something either that can be understood or so different about the future that it doesn't connect to the way their experience or how they've seen things in the past, or it's just the inability to think about more than one thing at a time, then the challenge is how do you in effect begin to evolve and help people at different rates with different individuals to be able to have the capacity to be able to understand that we are in a civilization change. It's only happened 2 other times in the history of mankind and womankind. Going back to the gathering age, to the agricultural age, to the industrial age. And I use, as you alluded to, John Cobb's concept of an ecological civilization. So we have people that now are challenged in terms of understanding, knowledge, and content. We have people that are scared to death, and we don't have enough leaders to help evolve in a new way to be able to deal with a different kind of future that's emerging. So I'm optimistic in the long run, but I also believe in the short run, Trump has opened up a whole bag of tricks that we're not going to be able to understand how to deal with until we work with them. And it's going to require us to be willing to spend time for our grandchildren. I'm talking about people my age that ordinarily would retire and go off into the sunset, to be willing to use our knowledge, our experience, the people that we know, and try to help evolve and develop a totally new approach as a society transforms.
And this is going to require a tremendous amount of responsibility on the part of everybody in the society, the leaders, the media in particular. And the media, a large part of the media have failed us miserably over the past several years. We see now that if we look back that there's so much misinformation, disinformation put out by media outlets, especially talk radio, One America, Fox, just a variety of them, perpetuating lies and rumors and myths about what was actually happening. And we have to reform ourselves. We really have to have an internal reformation. Well, Rick, I hate to do this to you, but in our last 45 seconds, do you see any unexpected issues that are out there looming that we need to be aware of today that you could just mention briefly?
Well, Bill, I'm delighted on purpose that you use the term reforming there twice at the end. So you would give me a chance to say that that the idea of transformation is going to be required to be able to deal with these kind of issues and these kind of complex situations and processes. But again, you and Global Connections Television and being able to introduce and build connections among people, processes, and ideas is more than an asset. It's absolutely imperative. And we thank you for the role that you and Global Connections Television are playing throughout the country and world.
Well, we're trying to get the information out and we're trying to help people better understand these issues because they're very complex. They're not easy to digest at times, as you know much better than the majority of us do. But Rick Smyre, I want to thank you today for being on the show and to thank you for the previous work you've done. And I really appreciate it. It was a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for all the help you've given, and best of luck.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.